It isn't moving. Every muscle down its spine is locked onto a ripple that hasn't even reached the bank yet. How does a hunter built for solid ground go on ruling a wetland that spends half the year underwater when the animals it now has to face there can bite back just as hard? This isn't the hard part of its day. It's barely the opening move. Pull back far enough, and the ground it's standing on barely qualifies as ground at all. This is the Pantanal, the largest wetland on Earth. And for months at a time, water decides how much of it is even usable. This is the only place built to take solid hunting ground away from a predator that has never needed anything else. Right now, in the last dry weeks before the rivers rise, the ground still holds. But that won't last, and everything sharing this water with it already knows the clock is running. To understand what's coming, first you have to see what this place actually is. The Pantanal covers an area larger than most countries, a floodplain stretched across Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay, fed by rivers with nowhere flat enough to drain quickly. From above, dry season grassland looks almost solid, dotted with shallow lagoons and threaded by slow brown-green channels. But this landscape carries two entirely different shapes depending on the month, and the difference between them isn't measured in temperature or light. It's measured in meters of standing water. Gallery forest lines the higher banks, the only ground that never fully goes under. Everything else is a bet on timing. By the time the rains build through November, this same open grass will already be disappearing by the day. The hardship here isn't cold or drought or a lack of food. It's the opposite problem. Too much water. Arriving on a schedule nothing here gets to negotiate. Between November and March, rainfall upstream pushes the rivers over their banks, and roughly 4/5 of the entire Pantanal can end up underwater at the peak of the flood. Ground that supported a full dry season food web simply stops being ground. Fish move into flooded grass that was solid weeks earlier. Caimans that spent the dry months packed into shrinking pools suddenly have an entire floodplain to spread across. And every hunter that relies on cornering prey against dry land loses that option at exactly the same time. Scale alone won't decide who keeps hunting here once the water comes. Its neighbors are about to make that very clear. A family of giant river otters works the same channel in a tight, noisy group. The falling dry season water has trapped fish into pools shallow enough to hunt with little effort, an advantage that disappears the moment the flood spreads everything back out. A capybara family grazes at the water's edge in the day's last light. More than a dozen animals packed into a space that easy prey usually can't afford to share. That density is the whole strategy. More eyes means less chance any one of them is caught looking the wrong way. From the tall grass behind them, the jaguar has already picked which one isn't watching. The approach stays low and unhurried, weight shifting forward only when the wind holds steady in its favor. One capybara lifts its head, and for a moment, the whole group seems to feel it before any alarm call actually sounds. The jaguar breaks from stillness into a full sprint the instant the gap closes to strike range. The group scatters into the shallows in every direction at once, water exploding around a dozen bodies moving faster than the jaguar can follow any single one. This time, numbers win. The target it picked disappears into the noise of the whole group breaking. A missed hunt here costs almost nothing. Further out, in water this hunter can't yet read as well, the margins won't be nearly this forgiving. A scent mark on a half-drowned tree trunk is fresh, and it doesn't belong to this jaguar. Dry season ground is already scarce. A second male testing the same stretch of high bank means the shrinking real estate has just gotten more contested, not less. The jaguar doesn't retreat from the scent. It starts marking directly over it. A low, rolling call travels across the water before either animal is visible to the other. The kind of sound built to be heard from far enough away that a fight isn't necessary yet. When the rival male does appear on the opposite bank, both cats hold their ground at a distance, ears flattened, weight loaded onto stiff front legs. Neither commits to closing the gap, not with this much water and this little solid ground to fight for footing on.
The standoff ends the way most of them do, not with contact, but with the rival male turning first and easing back into the tree line. Nothing about this is settled permanently. As more ground goes under in the weeks ahead, this exact confrontation will happen again on a smaller patch of dry land each time. For now, the protagonist holds this stretch of bank alone. But holding ground and controlling water are two entirely different problems, and the water is the one still undefeated.
At a narrowing channel where the dry season has crowded fish into one of the last deep pools, a Yacare caiman lies motionless at the surface, only its eyes and nostrils breaking the waterline. This is the one animal sharing this water that isn't simply prey or simply a rival. A caiman this size can kill a jaguar that gets the approach wrong. The protagonist studies the pool from the bank for a long time before committing to anything. This time, the caiman wins the scramble back to deep water, vanishing into a channel too dark and too its own to follow. The jaguar doesn't chase it in, not into water that deep, not for a meal that's already gone. It's the first real loss of the day, and the only animal in this entire wetland capable of handing it one. But the flood hasn't peaked yet, and every pool like this one is about to get a great deal larger. Days after the standoff at the tree line, the protagonist is patrolling the same stretch of high bank at a pace that has nothing relaxed about it. Every few dozen meters, it stops to rake claws down bark already scored from a dozen earlier passes. This isn't idle territory marking. It's active maintenance of a boundary that keeps getting smaller. A male jaguar in the Pantanal can hold a range that shrinks by more than half once the flood forces every animal in it onto the same remaining high ground. Losing this stretch of bank wouldn't just mean losing space. It would mean competing for hunting access on someone else's terms, at exactly the moment prey is hardest to find. Right now, holding this ground is not a formality. It's the difference between choosing where to hunt and being pushed to wherever nobody else wants to be. The strategy isn't subtlety, it's volume and visible presence, stacked on top of each other until the message can't be missed. A full-throated roar rolls out across the water, chest deep and sustained, audible for kilometers along a channel with almost nothing else to absorb the sound. The jaguar follows it by walking the exposed spine of the highest bank in full view, not hiding, not hurrying. Scent, sound, and sight, layered together, are built to end a contest before it ever needs to become physical. 2 bends downriver, the rival male hears exactly what that display means and doesn't test it a second time. For now, that's enough. The rival hasn't tested this stretch of bank since. But scent and sound only hold a boundary that still has solid ground underneath it. And underneath this ground, the water is already rising by the day. Small, unmistakable tracks cross the mud at the edge of the stretch of bank it just spent days defending, half the size of its own, printed by paws still learning exactly how much weight to put behind each step. Nearby, A flattened patch of grass in a den hollow shows where something small has been lying still for hours at a time, waiting. A female jaguar in this territory raises her cubs completely alone, without any help from a mate, for close to 2 years before they're ready to hunt on their own. The den she chose for this litter sits on ground that's dry today and will very likely be underwater within a matter of weeks. Every cub that doesn't survive this stage does so for the same reason. Not a predator, but a den site that flooded before its mother relocated it in time. She carries one cub at a time by the scruff, moving deliberately across open ground toward a den site on noticeably higher, drier soil. The protagonist keeping its distance nearby, tolerating her presence on ground it fought hard to hold. Each trip leaves the remaining cubs alone and exposed for the several minutes it takes her to complete the crossing and return. Between relocation trips, she pauses to let one cub paw clumsily at a half-dead fish left at the den's edge. A first, supervised lesson in exactly the kind of hunting it will eventually need in this water. Rain starts to needle the surface of the floodwater midway through the last crossing, and she doesn't slow down for it. By the last trip, the whole litter is settled on ground that should hold dry through the early weeks of the flood. Ground that's only available to her because something else already decided it was worth defending. For this litter, for this season, the relocation works. The den holds dry while the water climbs everywhere around it, on ground the jaguar never had to share with anyone by force. But these cubs won't be cubs forever, and the water they're being kept away from right now is the same water every jaguar in this territory will eventually have to learn to hunt in, the jaguar included. Weeks later, the transformation is total. The high bank it fought to hold is a narrow island now, and most of what was solid ground is open water, reflecting a flat, overcast sky. The jaguar moves through it not wading reluctantly, but swimming with long, deliberate strokes, head held high, completely at ease in water it avoided by choice only a month earlier. Beneath the surface ahead, a shape holds still against the current in a way nothing carried by that current ever does. The same Caiman from the earlier encounter, or one enough like it to make no difference, is basking at the flooded margin, half submerged. This is what the entire flood season has been building toward. A hunter with no solid ground left to hunt from, whose prey has scattered into water this same hunter is only now fully able to use. A Caiman killed cleanly here answers a problem no amount of patrolling or roaring back on dry land ever could. It also settles the one score the flood itself hasn't decided yet. Which animal in this water actually rules it? Every test so far has been about holding position. This one is about taking it. The approach happens almost entirely submerged, only the top of the protagonist's head breaking the surface, closing distance at a pace slow enough not to register as a threat. At close range, it surges forward and drives down, not for the throat the way most big cats would, but straight through the base of the skull, into the brain case itself, a kill method built specifically for prey armored everywhere else. The bite lands and holds, jaws clamp through bone, as the Caiman's body thrashes once, twice, water churning white around both animals. Within seconds, the thrashing stops completely, and the protagonist begins the slow, heavy work of dragging several 100 pounds of Caiman toward the nearest solid ground. It hauls the kill up onto the last dry patch of the sinking island, water sheeting off both animals in the flat afternoon light. For the first time since the water started rising, feeding here is not a question of if, only of how much. The skull bite that just ended this hunt is the same one used on capybara, on smaller Caiman, on almost everything this jaguar has ever killed. The flood didn't change the method, only where it had to be used. What the water actually decided was never who's the strongest animal in it. Take this one jaguar off this stretch of river, and the effect wouldn't be subtle. Caiman numbers here would climb unchecked through the dry season, crowding out the same fish stocks the giant river otters already have to compete hard for. capybara groups would grow bolder, denser, and eventually strip back the grazing that the entire flood season food web depends on regenerating. Even the hyacinth macaws nesting on the flood's own schedule are indirectly betting on this jaguar keeping capybara numbers from stripping the vegetation their whole nesting cycle depends on. A single apex predator holding a few kilometers of shifting bank is doing more to hold this place in balance than its size alone would ever suggest. So how does a hunter built for solid ground go on ruling a wetland that spends half the year underwater? Not by staying out of the water, and not by beating every rival it meets in it. It rules this place by being willing to change everything about how it hunts, while staying, underneath all of it, exactly as dangerous as it was on dry land. The flood didn't defeat this jaguar. It just made the jaguar prove it twice.